Thank you for listening or watching Weaving the Blanket, Stories of Faith, Sacrifice, Martyrdom, and the Emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is Season 2, Episode 1. Overview of the story arc, quote, the IMB begins to focus on bringing the gospel to the Aymara on the Altiplano, unquote. My name is David Stevenson. Last season, Season 1, the last episode, number 9, was entitled James Wimberg, Removed from Bolivia for Successfully Beginning to Educate the Indigenous. You may want to re-listen to it. In that episode, I spoke about the U.S. missionary James Wimberg, who successfully started the first school for indigenous in Huatajata, a good-sized municipal capital or county seat on the Altiplano in 1919. I also told how U.S. missionary Reverend James Washburn, who served as the district superintendent for all of Bolivia, a man with clearly cultural elitist views, if not outright racist attitudes toward the indigenous, and how Washburn got Wimberg fired and removed from the mission field. And I briefly stated that doomed the school and it was eventually closed. In Santiago de Hauta, in Poco Poco, in 1928, a teacher and local pastor of the IMB made yet another attempt at starting a school. A remarkable man named Mariano Molina became a local pastor. He was also educated and a teacher. Unfortunately, I know very little of Professor Pastor Molina, except that his name pops up at many crucial moments in the history of the IMB's early attempts to evangelize and educate the indigenous. In 1928, Pastor Professor Molina and 4 other brothers formed a small Methodist school in Santiago de Hauta. The evangelizing and educating of indigenous was a challenge to the authority and rule of the patrons as well as to the Roman Catholic Church, who they themselves were patron landowners with indentured peons on their haciendas. Education would expand the indigenous people's view of the world and question the authority and the right of the Criollo to own and hold indigenous people in indentured servitude on privately owned haciendas. And Protestant teaching, giving direct access to the scriptures and an opportunity to feel and know God and develop a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ, would threaten the religious power of the priests. It wasn't long before the patrons who lived and ruled in the community, along with the Catholic priest, whipped up mostly Criollo, the direct descendants of Spanish conquistadors, the Criollo and Mestizo population to attack the Methodist school. Sure enough, one day a mob came marching to the school and completely destroyed it. The mob found the Methodist teacher, Mariano Molina, and his wife, and also grabbed 4 Mestizo community members, Victor Duran, Felix Chirianos, Luis Viveros, and Genaro Palma, who had been sympathetic to the school. They dragged them all into the street. They were going to be expelled, as Nestor Peneranda put it, quote, for the great crime of having installed in the community of Santiago de Hauta the first evangelical school under the auspices of the Methodist mission, unquote. What happened was both bizarre and cruel. The crowd made these 6 persons to walk 5 kilometers through the streets, which were lined with people who would beat on them with fists, feet, and sticks. On the pretext of giving them rest, the mob forced these 6 martyrs to drink decomposing urine and to re-enter the town. Over 60 years later, in 1984, Pastor Peneranda described it this way, quote, but to make the entrance to the town more macabre, they made a rosary of animal skeleton bones, and after hanging them around their necks, they, the mob, mounted them, Teacher Molina, his wife, and the 4 supporters, on donkeys facing backwards. Thus prepared, a cruel parade entered the main square of Santiago de Hauta. They made them take 3 slow turns around the plaza while the spectators looked at them with anger, spilled garbage and ashes on them, a mixture that is used during Carnival. After this ceremony, which left the poor believers exhausted from so much raw martyrdom, they were accompanied by yet another league outside the town, where they received blows of sticks, hands, and feet, as if to say farewell. and they were sentenced to never to return to the town nor to think about setting up evangelical schools in these places. Peneranda explained what happened next. Quote, coinciding with this sad episode, a strange dream induced me to ask the then superintendent of the mission, Pastor Enrique McKinney, to go with me to see how were things for our brothers in Santiago de Hauta. It was a surprise when we found them in the middle of the road between Ancaraimas and Santiago de Hauta. We jumped off the motorcycle on which Pastors Batista Buck and Jim Palmer were taking us. They were wobbly, marked with hits and with bleeding wounds on their head and body. The signs of ashes and other filth clearly showed of the Calvary that they suffered. I told them, today is a great day for you. The blood that you have spilled on these pampas will serve as a fruitful irrigation so that thousands of Indians may be redeemed and the sun of justice shines for the outcasts of our great plateau. Those martyrs, instead of complaining and shedding more tears, replied with a smile, quote, yes, Pastor Peneranda, nothing hurts. We are the happiest of men today, unquote. As a postlude to that story, in the late 1950s, there was a president who was more sympathetic to the indigenous people. They decided to open up the first government-run school for the campesinos in Santiago de Hauta, La Escuela Norma Campesina. This school would educate hundreds of efficiently prepared teachers to work in the few but growing number of rural indigenous schools scattered throughout the vast Altiplano. Peneranda added this, I have had the great privilege of being invited to no less than the opening ceremony of the aforementioned school. In order to translate into Aymara the speech delivered on that occasion by the Minister of Education and Peasant Affairs, Dr. Bernardo Navajas Wheat. On such a propitious and solemn ceremony, I related to this Secretary of State, both the members of the Council of Education and thousands of Aymara who were celebrating such a great event, what had happened there in 1928 with those who dared to install the first school. I told them verbatim, quote, all these neighbors, Mr. Minister, are witnesses to the viciousness that I passed through these parts and the tears that I have shed when thinking about the future of my Indian brothers. But today is a happy day for me, as well as for them, because my wishes are completed. I will no longer run through the hills in despair like a defeated person, but I will continue working for the happiness of the Aymara, unquote. This was just a portent of the oppression, violence, and martyrdom of the Methodists which was to come. It is those events of oppression, violence, and martyrdom of a few missionaries and the early Aymara Methodists that I will be telling this upcoming season. Welcome to what we are calling Season 2 of the Weaving the Blanket, Stories of Faith, Sacrifice, and Martyrdom of the Emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. If you're wondering, Season 1 was 10 episodes, which I broadcast in both English and Spanish in 2020. If you would like to catch up on Season 1, go to the website at www.weavingtheblanket.com and scroll down to the bottom of the homepage for the links to the first season episodes. I visited Bolivia for the first time in 1986. I was 34 years old, a seminary-trained pastor who had served United Methodist churches in Oklahoma for over 10 years. I thought I knew the gospel, and I preached what I'd been taught. But on that trip, I began to hear the stories that are coming up. These stories transformed my life, my faith, my theology, and my understanding of what it meant to truly follow God. I hope the 10 or so episodes of Season 2 will have some of the same impact on you as it did on me. Our story arc for Season 2 has the long title, The IMB Begins to Focus on Bringing the Gospel to the Indigenous, which leads to oppression and martyrdom for IMB pastors and members. With these episodes, we are finally getting past most of the history of Bolivia and getting into the incredible life stories of some of the indigenous Methodists and the emancipation from the U.S. Methodist Church. These will be much more interesting stories, in my opinion. I've decided to tell these stories in chronological order as best I can, instead of just telling the different individual life stories of those involved. The reason is that, as I've said many times, these lives, these threads intertwine with each other, working with each other, or building on their predecessors' work. However, I've had a hard time getting a good timeline. We had a lot of new research on these episodes in the last couple of months, and the sources' dates don't always line up with each other. So I had to determine which source seemed to have the most accurate date and follow that timeline. Sharing these stories in chronological order means that the lives of different IEMB Methodists will weave into the story arc and then leave, only to return in later episodes to add their story, their thread, to the Bolivian aguayo we are weaving. In the coming season of approximately 10 episodes, Mariano Molina, the teacher who was abused in Santiago de Hauta that I had just shared, will re-enter the story once again, facing oppression and martyrdom. You will hear of the creation of the first indigenous Methodist church in South America, started by Pastor Nestor Peneranda, Mariano Molina, the teacher you just heard about, and a reluctant missionary named Virginia Whitehead. This new church was started in the Los Andes suburb of La Paz. The church was renamed El Redentor. I will also be telling the story of Tata Cipriano Tidrico, who walked 40 miles from Camata to La Paz, ended up in the Los Andes church, and despite it being against Bolivian law at the time, was baptized as perhaps the first rural indigenous Methodist in all of Bolivia. And we will hear of how Cipriano goes back to Camata, bringing Pastor Molina along, and starts the first permanent indigenous Methodist church on the Altiplano. You will also hear of the horrible abuses and oppressions he experienced from his former friends and neighbors. You will hear of Frank Beck, a U.S. missionary to Bolivia who decided that what Bolivia needs is not missionaries, but doctors. And God calls him at the age of 35 to go back to the U.S., get his medical degree, return to Bolivia, and start medical clinics to bring health care to the indigenous on the Altiplano. And then Dr. Beck, a U.S. citizen obviously, volunteers to join the Bolivian Army in 1931 and serves as an Army doctor throughout the Chaco War. You will hear of an abandoned 6-year-old Aymara boy nicknamed Feliciano, who became one of the first, if not the first, Aymara to be baptized and join the IMB on the whole Altiplano. Remember that the Los Andes Church is already formed and receiving members, however, it's located in La Paz and is not in the rural environment of the Altiplano. He will be a lifelong Methodist, and his false arrest will lead to a massive siege on Anchorimus by thousands of indigenous riders who loot the hacienda and eventually take control of the town. You will hear the story of the U.S. Methodist missionary Murray Dixon, who begins by being the director of the American Institute in Cochabamba, but begins to reach out and educate the indigenous, and of what most missionaries thought was the tragic accidental death on the world's most dangerous road in Bolivia. You will also hear new evidence that no one in the world who is living today has heard except me that his, quote, accident, unquote, may well have been no accident, but an assassination to stop the education of the indigenous. Listen and notice that as we add each thread to the Iguayu, as we tell each person's life story, it intertwines and removes obstacles and makes the next person's life story possible. They build upon each other. There should be no surprise about this because that's just the way God works. If you watch and listen, I hope you see what I see, the clear hand of God slowly, one step at a time, weaving together the Iguayu of the IMB, which brings the emancipation of the IMB and how the IMB is woven into the history of Bolivia. God was bringing emancipation and freedom of the indigenous people of Bolivia and of the world, just as assuredly, though not as dramatically, as he did with the enslaved Jews of Egypt. Most of the story content of this episode comes from the 12-page typed document, quote, History of the Local Church, Cipriano Titirico, Camada, North Lake District, Pioneering the Work of the Iglesia Evangelica Methodista in Bolivia. This document includes another document entitled Pastor Nestor Peneranda, the testimony that relates to the serious historical events of the arrival of the Evangelical Methodist Church to the community of Camada by Pastor Nestor Peneranda, an odyssey in the Altiplano in 1959. In my writing and speaking with people and reviewing my notes and recordings on the history of the IMB, I've realized there are some huge gaps in my knowledge of this story. I should be telling you the story of two amazing Criollos who became Methodists, one a pastor and one a teacher, who were absolutely critical to the development and the evangelization of the indigenous people of Bolivia, Pastor Nestor Peneranda and teacher Mariano Molina. Unfortunately, I only have small bits and pieces of their stories along with what I can find on the internet. Pastor Peneranda was from a prominent, wealthy Mestizo family. His cousin, Enrique Peneranda, was the commanding general during the second half of the disastrous Chaco War and became president of Bolivia in 1940. He returned Bolivia to the conservative, clerical, pro-hacienda policies of pre-war Bolivia, in almost direct contrast to Nestor, who was primarily working for the rights of the indigenous people. But other than that, I know virtually nothing about Peneranda nor Molina, except that their names keep popping up in crucial locations at crucial moments in the history of the IMB. I may in the future go back to Bolivia and research this story, along with other stories that I don't have. There may be more on this later. If you know any of these stories, please contact me at tulsadstevenson@yahoo.com. That's TULSADSTEPHENSON @yahoo.com. And I, an interpreter, will call and interview you. I also have one correction from an episode I did last year. I said, quote, in 1906, while still under Spanish rule, there were some great political changes in Bolivia. Bolivia's local administrators for the Spanish crown developed some liberal policies toward the existence of Protestants in Bolivia. The existence of Protestant churches was now officially legalized, unquote. That is way off. Spanish rule ended in 1825, of course, with Simón Bolívar, and Bolivia became a republic in 1906. It was the 1906 liberal anti-clerical government of Ismael Montes who changed the constitution giving freedom of worship in Bolivia. But as I've said many times, legal right is one thing, but openly worshiping and facing community justice and the anger of the Roman Catholic Church and the fear of Protestants by the Criollo and the ruthlessness of some of the dictators is something completely different. The truth was that some of the early missionaries held private prayer Bible study groups, and some even worshiped privately so as not to draw anger from the elite. I apologize for the mistake, and I wanted to get the correct answer on record. Pastor Peneranda, again on September 15, 1984, writes, quote, "The living memory of those tragic days of 1928 passes through my mind like a film, an impression in which men who raised the evangelical banner of the faith, and that they would very well serve as heroic characters in the history of Christian emancipation." Peneranda continues, "Today, the situation of the evangelical missions of our schools in the highlands differs greatly from what happened in 1930 in Ancaraímas. The religious and ecclesiastical work is making notable progress, thanks to the trust and guarantees offered by the Bolivian government for the good that we do and continue to do to the children of the Incas. The evangelical missionaries set the example through suffering and our great self-denial to do something practical for this race worthy of better luck, being a descendant of the Collamullos lineage. And today it gives us pleasure to see our Catholic brothers follow our example, also setting up schools for, quote, children of the sun, unquote. The torch is lit. Nobody will be able to put it out. Hundreds of indigenous teachers tell their brothers that they don't have to fear the school and that only school will make them free forever. Today, many hate the Indians for their awakening and for his great desire to improve himself and be completely free. We had become accustomed to seeing them always humiliated and slaves to the earth, and we thought that their awakening was a threat to those who made them suffer. But God is love, and we are evangelical Christians, those who are called to help them with true love and teach them to love their neighbor as well. It is true that due to his ignorance, he is daring. Let us forgive him with the consideration that he is worthy and he will change." End quote. Next week, we will hear the beginning of the story of the U.S. missionaries Frank and Bessie Beck, who went to Bolivia in 1916, became director of both the American Institutes in La Paz and Cochabamba, and then entered medical school in the U.S. so he could return to Bolivia as a doctor. It's a great story. If you would like to see photos from this episode or read some of the source material I used in writing this story, go to www.weavingtheblanket.com and navigate to Season 2, Episode 1 page. There is also links to the 10 episodes of Season 1. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.